Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David Ige.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Well, aloha. Thank you so much for being here on this Monday morning. I'm Yanji Denise. Ryan Kalei Suji has the day off, but we continue on with the show. And today we have a very special guest to talk about one of the issues that has plagued our community for so many years. We're going to talk about new strategies on how to address the homeless issue, not only here in Honolulu, but throughout the state. Joining us this morning is James Koshiba. He is the governor's coordinator on homelessness. Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Glad to be here, Yunji. Thank you.
So let's talk broad strokes to start. How are we doing when it comes to homelessness as a state? And let's look at let's talk about the urban core to start, but then also widen out to the neighbor island communities as well.
Sure. I think we can say a few things generally statewide about homelessness. One is we've made some strides at bringing home some certain subpopulations. For example, families with kids. 5 years ago, you'd see families with kids on the street. We don't see a lot of that anymore. But overall, we're struggling as a community. We're struggling like every other place in the country with extremely high housing costs. And the clearest measure of that is the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. That's folks who are not in shelters or transitional housing, folks who are on the street, on the beach, parked in their car on the side of the road and living out of it. That number continues to climb.
And how does that differ when we look at the urban core and we look statewide? Are we seeing the same levels when it, let's say on Hawaii Island that we see here in Honolulu, or does it differ depending on where you live?
Most counties across the state, including the neighbor island counties, have seen unsheltered homelessness rise. And of course, the core challenge there, and this is something that sets Hawaii apart from other states, is we have high housing costs across the board in Hawaii. There's very few places you can go and find, an affordable place to live. And that's our biggest headwind, really. I mean, when land is a commodity, everyone wants a piece of Hawaii. Competition for space is fierce. And if you don't have a lot of money, a single life disruption can mean you lose your spot. And then once you've lost your spot, you're at a serious disadvantage for trying to get a spot again. And so for folks that have the least resources and often who need, are in the most desperate need of places to be housed and healed, it's impossible to win this competition for space.
And when you talk about a single life disruption, this can be something relatively simple, like a car breakdown, a medical emergency, not necessarily, some like a major life event like getting cancer, but simply someone in the family falling and breaking a leg and then having an ER bill. Talk a little bit about, we've talked about the ALICE population in this show, in this program for people before, but for people who are not familiar, there is a vast part of our community that is really vulnerable and just one sort of misstep away from ending up in a very vulnerable position. Talk about that.
That's right. You covered some of it. It could be an injury, a back injury. It could be you're not injured, but someone in your family gets injured or has an illness and you have to become a caregiver. It could be an interruption in employment, a whole range of things. You or a family member could be struggling with an addiction. In the past, when housing costs were lower, people could still wrestle with these challenges and maintain their housing. But when you're in the kind of fiercely competitive, high cost market that we're in, the market doesn't have any space for folks in those situations. And people get squeezed out of the bottom of the market. They get squeezed out of the bottom of our existing safety nets. And that's why we have so many folks on the street today.
Okay, and you did talk about areas that are improving, which is people with young children, families. We're not seeing nearly as many as we have in years past. And when the Ige administration sunsetted, that was one of the things that that then Governor David Ige really championed about some of the gains that he had made. But where are you seeing things that are getting worse? Who would you say is the most vulnerable right now to homelessness?
Well, we still have a lot of folks that have been on the streets for months and years, and these are singles and couples. But I would caution us not to sort of categorize them separately from families, because those folks have families too. Some of them actually, are not in housing, so that other members of their family could stay housed, or they've been separated from their families temporarily. Um, but that's one category of folks. I think the other thing we're seeing is post-pandemic. The pandemic took a real toll on people and families, financially, mentally, physically. And so I get calls on a regular basis from people who are about to lose their housing or recently lost their housing, and they're in a bad way. And they're struggling, I think, with both physical and mental health issues post-pandemic in a way that pre-pandemic, we didn't necessarily see.
Hmm. I want to bring in a question from the audience. This is from Greg. He says, studies have shown that housing the houseless costs less money than now not housing them, haven't they? This whole housing first concept, that this is the best use of resources. What is the administration's policy when it comes to directing resources? How is the money best spent?
Yeah, so the answer to Greg's question is yes. Clearly, what's happening right now is, because there isn't enough housing at the end of people's journey toward home, people are cycling out in and out of temporary spaces over and over again, waiting months or years to get that voucher or that housing, that coveted housing placement. And the places they end up are in emergency shelter, hospitals, and jail. And those are very expensive places for people to be and stay. And not only that, they're not the appropriate place for people to be housed and healed in the long run. And so, as one example, I think the latest figure for incarceration cost is $270 per person per day. You know, as Greg pointed out, it's much more affordable to create space for people to house them than to be paying that kind of cost. You know, not to mention how much an emergency room visit and a hospital stay costs. So certainly in terms of cost and benefit, it makes more sense to house folks. That's where my priority is. That's where the administration's priority is. We've invested as a community. We've invested a lot of attention and resources in the short term and temporary spaces. We have emergency shelter, we have transitional housing, we have crisis outreach. But the question is where people transition into after that. And that's my focus. And that's the focus of the administration, is to make sure there's those spaces for people to transition into, so that they're not cycling in and out of temporary spaces, waiting for that permanent space to materialize.
Hmm.
And I think we've got to do that by any means necessary. If the ultimate solution to homelessness is about creating homes for people and bringing people home, and I'm not talking about low to moderate income housing. I mean, deeply affordable housing that folks with very limited income can afford. We've got to use all the tools at our disposal. That means expanding housing voucher programs, acquiring unused buildings and converting them into deeply affordable housing, constructing new affordable housing, deeply affordable housing whenever it's necessary and possible. And we've got to test some new ways to create housing in low cost ways that can so the housing can be sustained by the folks that are living there without the expectation they're going to somehow double or triple their income in a short amount of time. We don't have great solutions for that yet, honestly. And so that's where the governor's Kohale initiative comes into play, village style housing with shared facilities, bathrooms, kitchens, shared between multiple households. That housing can be built quickly and cost effectively. And if they're operated in the right way, if they're operated as a community, and by the residents who live there, they can also be operated affordably, because people then take, shared kuleana for managing their own neighborhood. They take kuleana for taking care of the place. They take kuleana for community responsibilities you normally have to pay for, like security or maintenance or groundskeeping. And that's the hope of the Kohale program. Is it's one kind of new idea to test, because we need these solutions to both create and operate housing that's truly affordable in the long term.
Yeah, curious about. I want to follow up on two things that you mentioned. One is this idea of deeply affordable, which is a term that I haven't heard before. When we talk about affordable housing, there are so many different metrics that go into, what things should cost. We see this a lot with developers and putting 20% of the stock at a certain rate so that certain, classes of people can afford that. But what is deeply affordable housing? How much are we talking about?
To me, and again, this is strictly from a perspective of someone you know, um, who I think has some understanding of homelessness or houselessness. I spent the last 7 years building relationships with folks on the street. And for someone who's trying to get off the street, trying to get back home, we're talking about rents that are $500 a month or less. And right now, there's nothing in the marketplace at that price point. But that's the price point we need to bring folks who are unhoused right now home. Most people on the street have a source of income. Many folks on the street are working. They might be working a cash job or minimum wage shift work. They might just have a disability check that they're depending on, or they have recycling income. But most folks on the street have a source of income. It's just not sufficient to afford anything we have in the marketplace. So when I say deeply affordable, that's what I mean. In terms of area median income, which is the categories that often get used when folks are talking about affordable housing, we're talking about folks that are on the very bottom of the income scale, under 30% area median income, not sort of the typical low to moderate 80 to 100 or 80 to 100%, 120% of area median income. We're talking about, the folks that are falling in that 30% or below income bracket, and who may have constraints to how much they can increase their income over time. They may have a chronic illness, they may have a disability, they may have limited education, they may have a criminal history that's preventing them from advancing in their chosen career path. But we got to make space for these folks too. Those members of our community have something to contribute to our community, but they don't have space right now. There's no space available for them.
Let's delve a little deeper into that Kohale concept. Nani Medeiros was a guest on this program a little while back, and she kind of explained it. But for those who may have missed it, what does that physically look like? How big are the units, and where are you looking to try to stand these up? Because it does sound that, unlike, let's say, building a high rise, this could be done much, much more quickly.
Yeah, and it'll look different from community to community. I think that the general concept is these are low impact housing units, low cost housing units. The the couple of models that we have, they're typically envisioned as modest home units without their own bathroom and kitchen that share bathroom, kitchen, and a dining facility with other households. So how many units share will be different from place to place. These could be detached modest home units, or they could be dormitory style housing in a building with shared bathroom and kitchen. I think the important thing about Kohale is that sharing those facilities does two things. One is it brings down the development cost substantially because you're not running infrastructure and putting the bathroom infrastructure in each household. You're having that cost shared. And two is that having some shared facilities also allows and encourages folks to cooperate and take shared kuleana for their space to kind of build those community connections and community sense of community responsibility. That's a positive in terms of not only the affordability, because as I mentioned before, these places can then be operated more affordably, but also in terms of people's safety and healing, and overall well-being. Again, going back to what I said earlier about the pandemic, one of the things that was so tough about the pandemic is that it isolated all of us. And we weren't able to have the connection and ties with people, sometimes in our own families and certainly in our communities. And for folks who are experiencing homelessness, and I think this is actually true for all of us, but maybe for folks experiencing homelessness in particular, having those ties and connections and feeling like you belong as part of a community around you and have something to contribute to that community is a really critical element of healing and growth and stability for the long run.
Where would you envision these going? And I think that In concept, it sounds great, but I wonder if you have any resistance from the communities where these are going, and if you could talk about that and sort of NIMBYism more broadly when it comes to this issue.
Sure. So right now, we're still looking at different sites. The goal is to have 12 over the next 3 years, at least, six on Oahu and two in each of the neighbor island counties. The location will really depend heavily on whether there's a community that's willing to accept and work with these spaces. And this gets to your question about NIMBYism. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, opposition, and that attitude, generally speaking, is one of the biggest hurdles we face. It's part of the reason why homelessness is so difficult to solve, because it takes a variety of forms, right? It's not just about opposing, I don't want a Kohale, in my neighborhood. It starts with, I don't want those people in the park who are living in the park to be on my block anymore. Get them out of here, right? Another manifestation of it is, I'm a landlord, I have an apartment. I don't want a formerly homeless person on a voucher to be renting from me. And then all the way up to the manifestation that I think you were alluding to, which is then when there's a proposal for a Kohale or a deeply affordable housing project or a treatment center or a group home in a neighborhood, there's opposition as saying, well, we don't want that here either. We don't want people in the park, in our neighborhood. And we also don't want the thing that could house and heal them in our neighborhood either. And we can't have it both ways. We just cannot. And I say this with a great deal of empathy because it's a pain point. It'll be painful and inconvenience for everybody. And every community needs to take some kuleana for this. Every community needs to say, okay, I understand NIMBYism is part of the problem. So if I don't want people in the park in my neighborhood, where in my neighborhood is there space for them? Where is there space for the group home, the treatment facility, the Kohale, the affordable housing? Where are those spaces? We got to flip that not in my backyard to yes in my backyard. And if we don't, we won't be able to solve homelessness.
How do we make that shift? Because that you're talking about a really deep, this is more than, money can't necessarily solve that. That's a real cultural shift to kind of welcome these solutions into your community. And so how do you actually foster that?
So I think the good news is we have some incredible champions of aloha in our communities, and since even before taking this job, but especially since taking this job and talking to folks about Kohale, there are people in community who have stepped forward and said, I want to create one of these in our community. And they're nonprofit organizations, there are some homeless services providers, but there are also churches and community groups and just individuals that have said, I have access to a piece of land. I'd love to put some tiny homes here, help people get off the beach and come over here to this space where they can be stable. They're not going to be swept anymore, and they can have a chance to be housed and healed. And for however long they need it, if they need this as a stepping stone to something else, if they need it more long term, I want them to be able to call this place home. There are people like that in our community. And I think the key is we've got to, when I say we, I mean government has to find those people, partner with them, lift them up as examples, because the not in my backyard opposition is only one element in our communities. There are also folks who are saying yes in my backyard, or literally, I live here, I have some extra space here on my property or in the property next to me. How can we put people here? How can we bring people home here? So we've got to lift up those examples, those champions, and government, state, counties should be looking to support and partner with them in whatever way we can.
When we look at homelessness, it's sort of there are different sort of, I would say, I'm reluctant to categorize, but basically people facing different challenges. There are the pure economic challenges that we've talked about, and getting someone into a Kohale situation or a deeply affordable situation could be the remedy. And then there are the issues of mental illness that we see, and people who are chronically homeless, what you referred to, people being homeless for months, if not years. How do we address that component, and how is your office looking at that? Because that is, I would imagine, a little more complex.
Yeah, and that to me comes down to a space issue as well. I mean, what the reason why there's a couple things I would say. One is that the percentage of people on the street who are houseless or homeless who have a serious mental illness or behavioral health issue is relatively small. It's probably about 1 in 5 folks on the street. And but of course, they're the most visible. They're the ones my office gets the calls about. They're the ones that representatives, elected leaders get calls about the most. The second thing I would say is part of the reason they're on the street is we had a big deinstitutionalization of people in the 80s and 90s. We said mental hospitals are not the right settings for these folks. This was a nationwide effort to get people out of institutional settings and into more community-based settings, kind of community integrated settings like group homes and recovery homes and spaces that were in neighborhoods. The problem was we deinstitutionalized a bunch of people and we didn't create those spaces for folks in community, actually. And so right now we're desperately lacking in space. There's very few places where people with mental and behavioral health issues, like deep addictions, can go to for any long-term period of time. The best we're doing at this point is emergency room and a short-term few day stay in a psychiatric ward. And those wards are very few and far between, or a stay at the Hawaii State Hospital, which is at maximum capacity. And so, again, it comes back to this idea that competition for space is fierce, especially for folks with serious mental and behavioral health issues. We don't have space. So we've got to make that space. And yes, we definitely need crisis outreach by mental health professionals. And I'm glad we're investing in that. CORE, the city and county's CORE program is an example of that. We need that. Law enforcement shouldn't be tasked with going out and dealing with folks with serious mental and behavioral health issues who are houseless. So I'm glad we have CORE. And at the same time, we need some place for people to go after the outreach. And we don't have that space right now. So we need something beyond just the triage and the temporary again. We need long-term spaces of healing, not just on the physical side, but on the mental and behavioral health side as well.
It's interesting that you bring up CORE. We had Dr. Jim Ireland on this program. Of course, he helps to run that program. And he had the exact same point that, his office is working so hard to engage these folks, get them treatment, but then long term, he has no place to send them. So inevitably, they end up back on the street. That is something that I would think needs, a much longer term solution. Is that something that your office is working on? And ideally, what would that look like?
Yeah, so that's part of the priority, right, for the administration, and I think it's a bit of a shift in thinking because, as I said before, we have been really focused on the short term, the crisis outreach, the triage, the temporary shelter, and we got to have this harder conversation about, where is the permanent space, and it's hard because it's a cost issue and it's an NIMBY issue, right, and so. Um, but now's the time to have those conversations. And so that is a focus of the administration. On the mental and behavioral health side, I'm still learning. I'm still trying to figure out there's multiple kind of tiers and levels of intensity of help in different kinds of spaces, all the way from inpatient hospital space to long-term kind of recovery homes to group homes where people are operating mostly independently to what they call permanent supportive housing, which is deeply affordable housing with some supportive services. It might be just a very light touch case management. And we need to understand, you know, what the needs are in each community. And they may be different from community to community. They may be different on the neighbor islands than they are on Oahu. But I can tell you the neighbor islands also have a desperate need for these kinds of spaces. Exactly how much space at each category and what makes sense for each community, we still have some work to do on that, but that is a priority. I mean, and ultimately, again, it comes back to finding and making space for people, whether we got to acquire it, pay for it with vouchers or construct it new.
We've been tackling this issue as a state for so long. We've been facing this. What do you think will be different about this administration's approach, about your approach in particular, since you are leading this effort here? And what are your metrics for success? How do we know when things are actually working?
Yeah, I think the metric of success is really a measurable and visible decline in the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, the number of people who are living on sidewalks and beaches and parks right now. So I think that's the overarching metric of success. I'm hoping that we can make a different kind of impact by keeping a laser focus on, okay, how do we create this long-term space for folks who just need deeply affordable housing, for folks who need deeply affordable housing with some support, for people who would be best served by kind of a village environment and setting, and for people that have more acute mental and behavioral health needs. But to me, it comes back to space, and I'm trying not to be distracted from that because I think that's the priority. And having the both the political and the community conversations needed to ensure that we have the resources we need to do that, and also the community support. That these spaces, if we're able to create them, don't get stopped in the last mile by not in my backyard opposition. So I'm hoping we can make a different kind of impact with that focus. The other thing is, and this may sound overly simplistic, but so much of this comes back to calling all of us back to a sense of community and aloha for each other, including for folks on the street who are experiencing houselessness. And this is something I learned from spending time with Twinkle Borge, Harepuohonua, Hawaiian, is I've seen that village be a safe place and a place of healing and progress for hundreds and hundreds of people. And the reason why it's able to do that with no resources and with no roofs over anybody's head, everybody's living in tents, is because there is an ethic of real caring and community there. And that gets people so far along the road to recovering, to healing, to finding their purpose again. And that's what's missing in most of our institutional settings. It's a hard thing to replicate in a shelter or in a transitional housing space. But we need that ingredient too. And for that, it's not going to be government that brings that to the table. To create spaces that make people feel like they belong and they're part of a community, we need those champions of aloha in our communities to step forward and not only say, yes, I want that Kohale in my neighborhood, but I'm going to go and I'm going to build relationships with those people. I'm going to go and take care of people in whatever ways I can in my off time. That's what's going to make these spaces, again, whether it's an apartment, a deeply affordable apartment building or a Kohale, that's what's going to make it feel like home for people. And that's when people are going to be able to grow and recover and use their gifts and contribute to our communities in the way that every one of us can.
We are almost out of time. Before I let you go, and you just touched on this very broadly just now about being invested and taking ownership and eliminating that NIMBYism. But what would you say to folks who are so frustrated and who really would like to see a shift in this issue? How can the community best support your efforts and really make some big changes when it comes to homelessness in our community?
I honestly, I don't have a better answer for that than, trying to find ways to connect with folks who are experiencing houselessness and to try to, um, I understand the frustration and I hear the frustration on a daily basis. So that the calls and complaints come to my office, and I've had conversations with folks, and what I say is, I get the frustration. And you realize we're not going to solve this without finding space for people. So if you want to make a contribution, be one of these champions of aloha. And that doesn't mean you got to go out and, become intimate friends with somebody who's on the street. But in any community conversation you're a part of, even if it's a conversation with your neighbors or your own family, raise this idea of, okay, yeah, it's frustrating, but where we don't want him in the park, where in our neighborhood then, or where in this community is there space for folks? Even just asking that question, and also being in touch with elected leaders with that kind of attitude is exactly what we need, because the elected leaders, they're hearing the same complaints I'm hearing. That's all they're hearing sometimes from their constituents. And so if they start to hear a little bit more of, hey, I want to be part of the solution, I want to find space. If government can come with resources and some institutional support, I want to be someone that helps find space. Or if I can't find space, I want to be someone that supports one of these Kohale. I'll bring, meals for folks once a month, or I'll just come and connect with folks. Whatever I can bring to the table, I'll bring to support. Those kinds of messages are what's going to change the political environment and political perception, and that'll make new policy solutions possible.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is really this idea that a lot of people just want this problem, if you will, to go away. But these are people and they are part of our community. They're not going away. We have to find a space.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, wonderful to talk to you today. Thank you so much, James Koshiba, the governor's coordinator on homelessness. We'll check in with you in a few months from now, see how things are going when the legislative session wraps up. We didn't really get too much into politics today. Perhaps we can touch on that next time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Yunji.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Well, great to hear from him. And, I've been reading all of your comments throughout this conversation, a very interesting perspective there. James Koshiba, for those of you who are not familiar, comes from a background of really doing a lot of advocacy work and direct work with the homeless. And so it's very interesting to see him now in his role as being part of the government, a big shift for him on a personal level. And he's bringing a lot of his personal knowledge and his relationships to this job. He expressed his optimism when it comes to Kohale and that concept. They're hoping to build at least 12, he said, over the next 3 years, three here on Oahu, rather 6 here on Oahu, and then spread out the other 6 throughout the neighbor island counties. Interesting to hear really what he's talking about is a fundamental shift in the way that we treat the homeless and the way that we engage with homeless in our community, and really welcoming some of these folks in our community in a different way, creating more spaces for them. First time I've ever heard the idea of deeply affordable housing. He's saying that, we need options for people that are less than $500 a month. There's nowhere in Hawaii really that can, that has that kind of rent. So how do we create that, and what does that look like? He had a number of ideas on this topic. So if you missed any part of our conversation, of course, you can go back and watch this again or listen as a podcast later this afternoon, wherever you get your podcast. On Wednesday, we are going to be checking in with Dr. Tim Brown. He's an infectious disease expert over at the East West Center, a fellow there. He's really been such a wonderful expert for us throughout the coronavirus pandemic. And we're going to be checking in with him about where we are on COVID right now, how things are looking when we look at global trends, variants that are emerging. What kind of a threat does coronavirus pose to our community, and how do we sort of deal with this in the long term? And also talking to him about long COVID and some of the impacts that that's having. So we hope you join us right back here on Wednesday at 10:30. Until then, take care of yourself. Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.